Okay, everyone, please take your seats. I realize that you've just been fed, are now high on a bit of coffee, and probably are thinking big thoughts. But we are anxious to keep things on time. That's the way we like to run things, at least I do. Our next speaker is Nick DeIuliis. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of CNX Resources Corporation, a company with a 160-year legacy in Appalachia. Thanks to an exceptional team, CNX has become a premier energy leader by pioneering new technologies and horizons, manufacturing consistent free cash flow, and championing long-term pre-share value creation. Nick is a vocal advocate for domestic energy, Appalachia, and the middle class. He is the author of Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America, and host of the weekly Far Middle podcast. In any case, as you know from our entire
recording in progress.
From our entire program here today, the goal of all of this is one thing. We have people with differences of opinion who take advantage of the respect for differences of opinion to come up here in the dais and to say their piece. We're very, very honored to have Nick here with us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him. We're going to start out with his comments, and then we're going to go to question and answer. Thank you, and take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's not going to be that bad. Thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. And boy, it is just awesome, this place. To be here at the birthplace of the modern oil industry, and it's fascinating to think, it just sort of blows my mind that shortly after Edwin Drake struck oil here, the company I work for, CNX Resources, our lineage just got to get going there. It was just starting out. And for 160 years, we've been at the forefront of Appalachia's energy and economic evolution, and today we continue to be a regional innovator. Now that term, regional innovator, it plays to the conference theme this year, which is at the crossroads, navigating America's energy and climate dilemmas. I don't see a dilemma as much as a crucial need for all stakeholders to accept the realities of the situation. So got a lot to say, a lot to cover. Let's get into it. We'll have some fun. This is civil discourse, right? So you're not going to likely agree with everything I'm going to say, but as we just heard, that's sort of the point of these sort of dialogues. Let's first talk climate. You know, weather obviously in the news quite a bit with the recent tragic storms. Climate change is happening. It's been happening for millions of years. It'll be happening for as long as there is a planet Earth. And we know that well before the start of the Industrial Revolution, when human beings figured out how to harness the magical power of that carbon atom, the extent of climate change has been much more severe than what we've seen in the past couple hundred of years. And I'll give you just three quick examples. Around 5,000 years ago, Florida Keys were completely underwater for substantial periods of time because of higher sea levels. Then at the time of Christ, in the Mediterranean, those sea levels and temperatures were significantly higher than today. And then around 1000 AD, there were Vikings in Greenland doing what? They were farming. We're not farming there today. And indeed, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased since the start of the Industrial Revolution. No question about it. It's gone from about 200 parts per million up to just over 400 parts per million today. And it's important to keep that proportion, parts per million, in perspective. A lot of people sort of lose track of what that means. Let's take something that a lot of us are familiar with, a college football stadium that holds 100,000 fans, maybe close to here, who knows. And a 200 parts per million concentration of visiting fans, that's basically 20 spectators in the stands. And 99,980, of course, are home fans. Now, if you double that concentration of visiting fans from 200 to 400 parts per million, the number of visiting fans has doubled. It's gone from 20 to now over 40, or roughly 40 fans. Now, has the atmosphere of that crowd changed to any observable extent? That's that's a debatable and subjective question. And despite CO2 levels going up and doubling the past couple hundred years, climate-related deaths globally, they've plummeted. They're down 95% over the past century. And we know that more people die globally from extreme cold, many more actually, than from extreme heat. So while this was going on, innovation with the shale revolution that allowed natural gas to displace enormous amounts of coal on the power grid. And that has reduced CO2 emissions tremendously the past 30 years. And that happened not from government, and not from mandates and not from regulation, and certainly not from wind and solar. I'll have a little more to say about that in a minute. But what was it from? It was from the private sector innovating with disruptive technology in places like right here in Pennsylvania. Yes, speaking of Pennsylvania, since 2005, using natural gas on our grid dropped state CO2 emissions over 40%. And the United States is also lower in carbon emissions since 2000, along with Pennsylvania. While the US and while Pennsylvania has experienced that path, India is up 150+%, China's up 200+% since 2000. So the developing world is using more coal than ever. And you can't blame them, because they're after reliable and affordable energy access, and who doesn't want that for their citizens? And then there's renewables, or so-called renewables. Frankly, I gotta be honest, I think the term renewables is a bit of false advertising. There's nothing renewable about wind and solar. And wind and solar are not zero carbon or zero emitting. The supply chain life cycle assessment of what it takes to produce a kilowatt hour from solar or wind, that's going to portray a huge carbon footprint. And wind and solar also suffer from very low energy density, which means it's almost impossible to scale it without ecological damage. So the amount of wind turbines or the acreage of solar panels that's needed to pursue net zero plans would require blanketing entire states with either solar farms or wind farms. And it also, wind and solar, they also bring some collateral damage along with them. Offshore and onshore wind are good examples. Offshore wind, whale kills up and down the east coast of the United States, and with onshore wind, the worst thing to happen to birds since the cat. These realities are why it's concerning to see what elites and experts are forcing upon society and economies when it comes to policy cures or the medicines to tackle climate change. The consequences of those medicines or cures could be significantly worse for economies and quality of life across the globe than the actual symptoms or ailments of climate change. So consider the carbon dioxide emissions tied to wind and solar, and EVs for that matter, and their supply chains that I just mentioned. Just walk through the supply chain. First thing you have to do, you've got to do massive mining and movement of surface area to get the requisite materials, and that's going to require substantial carbon-fueled energy and transportation and equipment. And then most of that is going to happen offshore from places like the United States. Secondly, once you've mined the stuff, you need to concentrate the stuff into purified feedstocks, and that's going to require even more carbon energy. Again, most of it occurring in foreign locations. And then once it's concentrated, all those feedstocks come together in a manufacturing facility, start building the components for the wind turbines and the solar panels and the electric vehicle batteries. And those factories are likely powered by a carbon-based grid, often coal-fired. Then all those components are going to be transported to the United States and Europe, and whether it's ships or trucks or rails or planes, what's going to fuel that transportation? Yes, carbon-based energy. Oh, and then when you construct the wind turbine towers and the solar arrays, that's going to require concrete, clearing trees for grid, for paths, clearing right-of-ways, and metal transmission lines to basically transport the kilowatt hours. All of those things carry substantial carbon footprints. And then once everything's installed, the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine in places like Pennsylvania, which is often the case for those of you that are from here like me, you're going to need a reliable backup, which is likely going to be some form of carbon-based power. So you add it all up, that's a very substantial carbon dioxide footprint for wind and solar, and a legitimate accounting of the life cycle CO2 footprint for EVs that's going to show effectively the same thing. And that's why sometimes the consequences will not be positive ones with pursuing the policy medicines that have been prescribed. The promised cure sometimes can be indeed worse than the vilified disease. But there are other negative consequences. Wind and solar are not cheap. When you make them the foundation of an electric grid, we see proof of that everywhere. Wind projects in particular are struggling because of poor economics and higher costs. And then there's the other negative consequence of general inflation. It's not a coincidence that general inflation is raging as economies and societies embark on these net zero plans, because the latter causes the former. You increase the cost of energy, you create energy scarcity, you reduce reliability, and that's going to adversely affect the cost of everything in society because everything utilizes energy. Now, none of this is good news for consumers or the middle class or businesses. And balance of trade is another thing that will suffer. because China, unfortunately, and quite astutely, has built a stranglehold on the supply chains to manufacture an electric vehicle or a wind turbine or a solar array. In the US, Europe, we simply cannot mine, process, or manufacture enough of the stuff that's needed for a net zero plan relying on wind, solar, and EVs. It's ridiculous to assume so when you run the math. Now, all those consequences being potentially what they are, I think the worst situation when it comes to some of the climate policy prescriptions are what happens when you look at geopolitics. Climate policies at large enable a bunch of bad actors across the map, and we're seeing that. Russia's a case in point. It now enjoys energy leverage over Europe. Why? Because predominantly of EU climate policies. Europe purposely shut down domestic energy sources of natural gas and nuclear. You couple that with a mad dash for wind and solar, which failed to deliver at scale. That created an energy imbalance, and that imbalance was filled by Russian natural gas flowing through pipelines like Nord Stream. Putin saw leverage. He was emboldened to invade Ukraine, not once, but twice. China, as I mentioned, has been gifted enormous leverage from Western climate policies. Again, it controls the supply chains of wind, solar, and EVs, and now China is able to confidently eye up Taiwan. How about OPEC? The US shale revolution slayed OPEC. But the climate alarmists, with their policies, they dutifully resurrected OPEC because we need Mideast oil to flow to keep the price of oil down, which is crazy. But what's even crazier is what we see with Iran. Iran knows that its oil is now necessary due to climate policies. So what do we end up doing? We appease, we loosen sanctions, and we literally fly pallets of cash to them on carbon-fueled planes. The irony of that should not be lost regarding our ex-Secretary of State and Climate Czar. This debacle reaps hundreds of billions of dollars for Iran, which it uses to fund Hamas, Hezbollah, and then pursue nuclear weapon capability. And then totalitarian Venezuela, yet another example suffering from the same root cause, Western climate policies. It went from a pariah under heavy sanction to where now we ease sanctions, respect sham elections, we tolerate kidnapping of our citizens by their government, and then we ask Chevron to flow billions of dollars of Venezuelan crude. But the biggest tragedy when you look at the geopolitical map, it's individuals in the developing world without access to reliable, affordable energy. Climate alarmist policies, they ensure that those people continue to be denied reliable and affordable energy. And what gives us, or anyone, the moral authority to do so? So this is potentially a mess. What's really behind all this? Where's this all coming from? Because they make no sense, the policies, when you look at chemistry, physics, math, and economics. I think I know the answer to that, and it's a malignant adversary lurking both externally and internally. The natural enemy of Western Republican democracy is the left. It could be communist, it could be socialist, it could be totalitarian, or some combination. And the left benefits from climate policies on an unprecedented scale. Now, external vanguards of the left, they are co-authors of many climate policies. It's been well established that Russian interests are huge funders behind the ban fracking movement. Climate policies end up forcing a transition from energy independence that the West enjoys to an energy dependency on totalitarian nations of the left. The adversaries found here internally as well. The left despises the individual and his or her freedom to choose for themselves. The left wants to tear away that freedom and then place that decision-making power, of course, in the hands of a higher authority, a religion, an ideology, the state, the expert class, or some combination or cocktail of all of those. And what better way to achieve the aims of the left than by controlling energy? If you wanted to control society and the individual, but you could only choose one industry or sector to achieve it by, which one would you pick? Now, a lot of people might say healthcare or finance or tech, and those aren't bad choices. But I would choose energy if I had only one. Because the kilowatt hour, the horsepower, the BTU, they touch everything in a modern economy. If you control the kilowatt hour, the BTU, and the horsepower, you control decision making. Folks, climate policies may not be about atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, and they may not be about weather. They might be about control. And if my premise is correct, you would see climate policies bleeding into things beyond the generation grid. And we're seeing just that. Consider food. What you can and what you should eat is now being attacked by everyone from radical environmentalists to the United Nations. Now experts demand we consider the carbon footprints of food. And there's a hit list out there. Bread, meat, ice cream, beer. So if you like those foods, I've got some bad news that might be coming your way when these climate policies continue on their inevitable march toward the individual. Driving is another front in the fight. What better expression of personal freedom is there than the personal automobile? With EV mandates, the individual now is reliant on the availability of the grid and when and where you may charge. Climate policies aim to transition the personal car from a quality of life booster for the masses to a luxury of the 1%. It's another form of control. And did you hear the concept, are you familiar with the concept of 15-minute cities? It's a movement that you find in many climate policies to ultimately force individuals to live in urban areas within so many minutes of walking distance to public transportation, because that would be the only mode of transportation available, and to force living in smaller apartments versus larger individual homes. And then climate policy is also manifesting in emergency powers. Climate emergency days that you now see in places like California. So when it's hot, don't charge your EV, don't run your air conditioner, don't open your business. It's a grid emergency, ironically created by climate policies. The end goal is for the individual to lose control over their own decision making. Instead, trust in the higher authority, trust in the government or the expert, in line, of course, with the ideology of the left. They'll take care of you, they'll tell you what to do, but you know, history informs us what happens once the left controls. So wow, you know, with all of that, what is an energy industry keystone state American to do? Well, I think there is quite an exciting path if you assess. And I admit I've got a somewhat contrarian view versus the common consensus what I'm about to lay out. So let me share my thoughts, see what you think. First, I do agree with certain aspects of the common consensus. I agree the policy in key sectors of the global economy, they're going to continue to pursue lower CO2 emissions. Maybe not zero, but much, much lower than current. I agree the policy is mandating electrification of everything, and that's going to result in unprecedented demand growth for the power grid. Most recent example being data centers and AI that everybody's talking about. And I agree that the ability of wind and solar to deliver uninterruptible, reliable, and low-cost energy at scale to feed that growing grid demand, let's just say it's extremely suspect. I'll be kind there. Natural gas, just going through that, should be the clear winner across energy sources to meet higher energy demand and lower CO2 intensity. Better yet, here we are in Appalachia, in Pennsylvania, with the Marcellus and Deep Utica. It's a premier natural gas deposit on the planet. Now, if all this comprised the complete analysis and the entire game board, one would rightfully conclude that the Appalachian Basin is poised to flourish. And one would have expected these results to have already manifested across a bunch of current market metrics. Yet that has not occurred. And I believe it won't occur without a shift in the situational assessment by the industry, by the capital markets, and by policymakers. We are misreading things. I believe that policy across governments and bureaucracies is going to prohibit the smooth allocation of capital into infrastructure to link Appalachian natural gas supply to growing grid demand. In attempts to navigate those roadblocks, you're going to meet a coordinated lawfare campaign that's going to strangle you with litigation. The idea of a new pipeline, natural gas pipeline, to send Appalachian molecules to places like Boston, it's obvious that it makes sense. But such a pipeline is not going to be allowed to be built. It's counter to that ideology that permeates a system from which approval must be secured to proceed. I think supply from the Appalachian Basin is experiencing a step change evolution with the Deep Utica. The Deep Utica is going to fundamentally change this basin for the better. CNX has been one of the pioneers, has pioneered the horizon, and we see it delivering a new level of supply, i.e. higher, and a new sort of response time, i.e. quicker, for the basin. So when you've got a basin that establishes higher potential supply and delivers it quicker, and it's artificially bottled up due to the inability to invest in logical infrastructure like pipelines, there's going to be in-basin pricing consequences. And unless something creates new demand or takeaway, a sustained upside for Appalachian pricing, that's going to remain elusive, supply and demand. So the industry initially looks to LNG, liquefied natural gas, and exporting it as being the answer. However, to unlock the next wave of Appalachian supply, LNG is going to require more pipelines to move our product to coastal LNG terminals. And even setting aside the infrastructure constraints on pipelines, a true step change in LNG export capacity That's a non-starter over the next decade due to policy and legal constraints, the most recent example being the LNG permit pause that we read about. Now, many point to then a growing grid demand. They say, all right, if LNG isn't going to happen soon, what about that power grid demand in AI and data centers, things like that? After all, that type of a solution in basin wouldn't require new long-haul pipes or large-scale LNG facilities to get around some of those challenges. But the tech industry, who buys the power to feed the data center economy, they demand that the power come from something that offers low net zero CO2 footprint. So they don't want just low cost and reliable, they want low cost, reliable, and low or net zero CO2 power. So those realities, when you look at sort of that view of the world, at least from my perspective, they may depress at first blush. But there is an exciting path available from the herd mentality. And what would that look like? Well, it's been what we've been up to. And there are key industrial sectors of today's economy that are growing and they've got an appetite for energy. Hydrogen and the hydrogen economy, along with the IRA provisions, is one example. Aviation with sustainable aviation fuel. Talked about the power grid and AI, transportation fleets. Energy to those sectors, they've got to meet certain criteria. So you got to check some boxes, so to speak. You need to be reliable, you need to be uninterruptible, low cost, short supply chain, ready now, right? Not 10 years from now, ready now, net zero or low CO2, okay? And obviously, last but not least, you need to be able to demonstrate no harm to local regional ecosystems. None of those touted energy solutions check all the boxes. Wind and solar, covered that enough. Nuclear has a lot of excitement, but recent experience is not promising at scale. Ultra high cost to build, as evidenced by Georgia Power's experience recently. So it's not so much a ready now, it will take years to build out at a serious scale. Natural gas, hey, many advantages, just about all of those boxes checked, but one key shortcoming of not being net zero CO2. So what energy solutions would check all those boxes? Well, Appalachia does offer a few. And the first is captured coal mine methane, or CMM. So the Department of Energy has determined that CMM is a carbon negative product that reduces the methane emissions entering the atmosphere. So there's a climate benefit to capturing that and utilizing it and combusting it instead of allowing it to vent. And when coal mine methane is custom blended with the Marcellus and Utica shales, companies like CNX can deliver to customers an energy supply with the exact carbon intensity desired. The CMM blend product, it's got a fraction of the cost of new nuclear. It offers scalability, reliability, and supply chain benefits that are far superior to things like wind and solar. But solutions are not limited to CMM. Technologies now ready for deployment allow us to harness the unique characteristics of the deep Utica. It's one of the reasons why it's going to fundamentally change things in this basin and beyond to manufacture low-cost, low-carbon intensity, compressed natural gas CNG or liquefied natural gas LNG on pad, and manufacture these on pad at the wellhead, serving markets well beyond those linked by existing pipelines. So all these products are available to meet growing sectors of energy demand. You go back to hydrogen production. At scale requires enormous amounts of reliable energy. The CMM blends with shale gas, it's a ready now solution to provide net zero hydrogen at scale. And when you couple that with the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that should kickstart the hydrogen production economy across Appalachia. Talked about aviation. Okay, sustainable aviation fuels and attempts to decarbonize aviation, it's remained elusive as emerging alternatives to existing jet fuels have failed to meet scalability and cost challenges. But CMM blended with shale gas provides a net zero CO2 solution. We've got a project with our partners at the Pittsburgh International Airport. That's going to be the first sustainable aviation fuel plant at scale utilizing CMM. That's happening within Appalachia and within Pennsylvania. A lot of talk about reshoring American manufacturing and industry. That's another opportunity. We're partnering right now with a company out in California known as New Light Technologies, and we're providing coal mine methane blends as a critical feedstock into their manufacturing process to create, get this, a revolutionary net zero biodegradable plastic substitute product. It's an amazing company. Check out New Light Technologies if you get a chance. But manufacturers like New Light, they are looking to decarbonize and de-risk supply chains, and they're going to look, when they think this through and run the math, to places like Appalachia and Pennsylvania. And then AI, we talked briefly about that prior. Yes, it's going to increase energy demand. We are uniquely positioned as a basin to benefit from this growth due, first and foremost, to our proximity to coal mine methane and those short supply chains to shale gas and all this legacy infrastructure that we have in places like Pennsylvania. But the AI economy needs energy solutions at scale, and they need it today. Data center developers, logical customers for coal mine methane blends and things like on-pad CNG, LNG. And then speaking of pad-level CNG and LNG, they are poised to materially disrupt transportation fleets that are served currently by diesel and by gasoline. So those types of solutions with CNG and LNG are reliable on pad, reliable, local, ready now to improve emissions and economics by converting away from heavier hydrocarbons. Yeah, when you think it through, the opportunity set for this basin and for places like Pennsylvania is exciting. And end markets are just starting to realize it. I think we're about to experience a transformation of the Appalachian Basin once again. So, real solutions to real problems, they require policy rooted in objective fact. That was sort of the point of my prior commentary. And there is also the need for good macro policy across a whole suite of different issues, energy front and center that we discussed, but also good regional policy. We've got to get regional policy right as well. And on that note, I want to wrap up with an approach that CNX is working on to change the paradigm on the local and the regional level. We call it radical transparency. So what is it? Well, it's data-driven monitoring, analysis, and transparency to guide policy that protects the public and recognizes the important role of energy in places like Pennsylvania and Appalachia. We built and rolled this effort out with the help from Governor Shapiro and the Pennsylvania DEP. We're monitoring air and water quality, waste, methane in and around all of our operations, our pads, compressor stations, etc. We're open sourcing the data for all to see real time. This is a critical aspect of radical transparency. We can't continue as an industry to hold our data in a black box and release it on our terms to a limited audience. You can find our data on the web live as we speak, if you wish. And the data are collected independently by an accredited third party, and then the Pennsylvania DEP is provided this data unabridged at the same time it's provided to us. That's further transparency and confidence. It's a actually simple but very powerful concept, radical transparency. And without real-time transparency, industry data will always be questioned and dismissed. So our view is let's provide it. Yeah, we're just getting started with the radical transparency effort, so expect to hear much more about it in the future. Happy to talk to you about it. Our team's happy to talk to you about it as well if you're interested. Look, I could go on all afternoon. I'm not allowed to. I don't want to do that to you. I do appreciate your attention, and if we want to engage in some Q&A or some dialogue, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you.
Great. So I'm hoping we get some questions out of that very provocative talk. So who's first? Okay, let's down just a second.
I have a question about the coal bed methane that you were referencing. I understand that a lot of the coal being mined in Pennsylvania right now is going overseas because we're not using as much as we used to for things like electricity generation. Is there a risk of not having access to that methane if we continue to see less coal production in the future? And there's a lot of pressure on the industry right now. How does that factor into your plans, knowing that policy sometimes is unpredictable and you don't know exactly how it's going to play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we get a lot of questions surrounding that coal mine methane and capturing it, how it's tied basically to the coal industry itself. Most coal production today in the United States, whether it's staying domestically or exported, is largely driven by metallurgical steelmaking demand for coking coal. So what we're doing basically is what's left with regard to coal mining activities and longwall operations in Appalachia. We're basically capturing methane that would normally be vented through that activity today. And then there's also an opportunity to capture methane after the mine has been retired or closed down. That's another big area of opportunity when it comes to climate impact. What we do know, so the first thing to understand there about the coal mine methane capture, this is not actually resulting in any net increase to any of the energy mix. It's not going to result in more coal being mined. It's not going to result net in less natural gas being consumed, because some of the coal mine methane that you capture will then be displacing other natural gas that you would need otherwise. Second thing is, we do know, going back to these sort of questions, that affects the math of what the carbon intensity score is for coal mine methane. So the Department of Energy at Argonne spent, I want to say, 1.5 years studying this in depth, and came away taking into account life of mine, how much methane is liberated without capturing and investing capital to do so, how much then are you benefiting by if you capture it and then combust it in a process. And they've been able to basically capture that dynamic. It starts with your question, to come up with a carbon intensity score. And it is a very substantial carbon intensity score. In other words, one of the most, if you're looking to mitigate CO2 concentrations or CO2 equivalent concentrations in the atmosphere, one of the most effective and impactful things you can do is capture coal mine methane instead of allowing it to be vented into the atmosphere.
Who's next? Oh, sorry.
So maybe I don't 100% understand all the technology here, but will your pathway require, it seems to me like it's going to require the building of lots of additional pipeline capacity. Is that a true statement or not? It seems like it's going to be a lot more, and there's a lot of public pushback on that. Not for me, but it's there, you know it. So I'd like to hear what you say about that.
Well, you're not the only one that doesn't fully understand it. I don't either. But so don't feel bad about that. It's very complicated. I guess I'm saying two things. One, if left to basically find the most efficient path within energy mix, supply and demand, energy infrastructure, you would see much more significant midstream pipeline infrastructure that had already been built. And you should see more to follow. My view is that is not going to happen because of the reasons that you just outlined, policy. So what happens in lieu of that? Because the world's appetite, from Pennsylvania to the developing world, the world's appetite for energy is going to continue to grow. Now, originally, the view was, well, wind and solar at scale and electrification of everything, including transportation, that will be our answer. And there's two problems with that. One, they're not zero carbon solutions at all. And two, their ability to perform reliably at scale, it's not going to happen. So now what do? Well, in the interim, you get some of these negative consequences with places like Russia that say, well, Europe, I'll fix your energy imbalance, basically, that was manufactured by policy, but now I'm going to feel emboldened. Or, China may want to take advantage of certain policies when they basically control the supply chain for things like wind and solar and batteries. Long term, I think what I'm saying, my view as to what happens with places like Appalachia is that there's going to be still an energy imbalance in basin and beyond. And the way that you basically address that is not by building additional pipelines or exporting LNG to other places across the planet, but instead you start to displace and you start to feed demand for energy in basin first. So if you think about ground transportation, right now the cumulative supply chain of a gasoline station or a diesel, equipment running on diesel is tens of thousands of miles, versus an alternative that would basically look at manufacturing CNG or LNG, depending on the application, on pad in Appalachia, right, to basically fuel those transportation vehicles. It could be a municipal public transportation network, it could be a FedEx or an Amazon fleet, or it could be, depending on how far these propagate, individual personal vehicles, etc. That has a CO2 benefit to it. Net you're lower in CO2. That has an absolute cost benefit because methane, natural gas molecules are much cheaper on a per million BTU basis than gasoline. And that has a bunch of geopolitical and regional economy benefits as well. It's those types of opportunities. There might be a grid opportunity there with AI data centers. Again, CMM blends can help get that CO2 intensity where the tech industry may want it. So they build more of that here. Displacing transportation fuels, onshoring manufacturing, companies like Newlight that want to build manufacturing facilities, have them build it here within Appalachia. That's where the opportunity is from our perspective. It's creating basically new sources of demand in basin so that you don't need an interstate pipeline to send the molecule to the southeast, or you don't need an LNG export terminal to be built on the east coast of the United States.
So I am a Pass County Planning Department land use planner and deputy director. I went to school for civil engineering. I have a big passion for community planning, and I was just curious if you can help me understand the way that we describe things. It matters, right? So I'm curious, as the way that we talk about, and I heard you talk about the internal enemy, the left, comparing totalitarian nations with 15-minute cities. And I've done a lot of research on 15-minute cities, the importance of creating strong, resilient downtowns, communities, and that's so important to me. I guess when you had said that the end goal is to lose the individual's control, that's a little worrisome as not only a planner and a community developer, but also as a city council member. That's a priority for me, is to create a community where people can walk or bike, to their shopping areas, to their work, to their schools for their kids, and education, recreation, healthcare, all these things. So we want to create more self-sufficient neighborhoods, and that reducing the need of long commutes. So my question to you is, while these 15-minute cities, they enhance personal freedom, and they're very community-centered, I was curious if your thoughts on a politically fueled 15-minute city, which to my knowledge does not exist. They're urban planning concepts. Is it the lack of demand on gas that's your concern because it's a shorter commute for people? Or I guess that the beginning of how you started your conversation, I was just a little confused, and I want to make sure that we're talking about creating self-sufficient and energy secure communities.
Sure. So fellow engineer, you're civil, I'm chemical. I'm a big fan of urban areas myself. I grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, so I've seen firsthand when it gets it right and when it gets it wrong. 15-minute cities are definitely a reality that are manifesting in climate policies, most predominantly in Europe for now, but it'll be coming at some point. And the issue is not an issue of whether apartment living is a good thing or a bad thing, or public transportation is a good thing or a bad thing. The issue is who gets to choose. Do I have a choice? I may be an avid biker. I may love urban living, I might love country living, I might hate traffic and commutes, right? But I want to be in a position where I decide. And this gets back to sort of vibrant, you mentioned vibrant economies, vibrant cities. Fundamental belief that I've got, and again, people may disagree, is that you cannot have a vibrant economy or society without a vibrant private sector. So although you always want things that have some form of policy informed, the sustainable, the truly sustainable economic ecosystem, whether it's urban, whether it's for a state, whether it's for a nation, you've got to have a self-sustaining private sector. And a lot of these policies from the climate policy arena, 15-minute cities, the EV mandates, the emergency powers, not this energy mix, that energy mix, you will not build that, but you will build this. Okay, when you start to cumulatively take into account what they add up to, the individual is going to be the first casualty. Whether the individual loves to bike or whether the individual loves to drive, and whether the individual is an avid environmentalist or whether the individual is, whatever, is a conspiracy theorist. And the individual, from my perspective, reigns supreme. So policy matters, and it's not a D or an R thing. It's an ideology thing. And getting policy right, we've seen, and again, city of Pittsburgh, where I'm from, it's a prime example. I grew up in the late 70s and early 80s. I can tell you what happens when the private sector disappears. Okay, it's ugly. And there's a lot of pain and suffering. There's a lot of collateral damage. And industries like energy, in places like this, we don't just drive these regional ecosystems. We basically create the opportunity for that individual to thrive, not just across the United States, but across the entire globe. So that's sort of why I come at the issues that you find like 15-minute cities in climate policies and climate policies in total. And I'm not against, I lived in apartments. I'm not against them. I am against the mandating that people must ride that, must live there, must use this type of energy or must use that type of energy. Just a perspective.
Okay, I think we're right at time. And in the interest of keeping the trains running on time, please join me in thanking Nick for his presentation.